Hello again. My name is Sam Robinson, and this is the Gnostic Secretist Podcast. Thank you for joining me. Everyone is welcome, no matter your background or belief system. We're all here to unlock the mysteries of the esoteric tradition. So, in our last video, we were doing part one of the origins of humanity and our cosmic evolution and spiritual development through varying states of existence and form and consciousness and the varying principles. And when we get each one of these seven principles, which are the Atma-Bhuddi, the manas, which is the spirit, the spiritual soul, the mental body, the I, the animal soul, the astral body, the etheric body, and your physical body. So, in our last video, I was going through the beginning of cosmology from the absolute through differentiation down to the 7 times 7 incarnations, which are the very foundation of the esoteric tradition. Foundation absolutely essential to anyone wanting to understand who they are, where we come from, where we need to go, and what the essence of our being actually is with our 7 principles. Something you will not find in any of the New Age belief structures or systems, nor will you find it in the ancient aliens or the stuff about galactic councils or the Pleiadians or the Blue Avians or any other type of alternative spiritual paradigm. They don't mention these things. Now, you'll find some of this potentially in Gnosticism, but other than that, or in the Kabbalah, you won't find anything like this. Then again, Gnosticism and the Kabbalah are also esoteric systems that have exactly similar cosmology and concept of humanity and the unfolding of the universe from an absolute principle down to the material realm and material plane that we live on. So we will begin where we left off, which was going through the 7 root races of humanity. And the 7 root races go in this scheme, 7 root races in the 7 subtle bodies, through involution and evolution. You have the Pangaian physical, which is, I guess, basically the end of the root races, but you really start here. And the Polarian first root race, which is the monadic. Well, they call it the monadic root race. This is basically a state where we only have a monad and a vehicle of expression, a form of astral body, a astral shadow. It's technically our what you would call the human vehicle, the physical body, but it's not physical at this point in time. It is in an astral etheric state. It is of the most absolute tenuous type of substance. It is not materialized, and it does not have a mind or an astral body or even an ether body or even an animal soul. It is just a monad, and it is just a vehicle, a physical body in a non-physical state. It is not material. It is not a materialized body yet, and you are senseless. You are a mindless being at this point, with just the 2 principles, the highest and the lowest principles. And then you fall through these other states. But let's go ahead and go through some more specifics. The way this being, this first root race, so to speak, reproduces itself, because it is sexless. It is an astral androgyne or androgynous being that is sexless. And there are no male and female yet at all. It, according to the Theosophical tradition, reproduces itself very much akin to cellular mitosis, where a part of this being, which is almost like a blob of astral form with a single divine spark within it, it will split off into another form from the original one, like a cell does, where it splits off to make another cell, and then the 2 cells are of equal size and structure and characteristics. The first root race forms mitosis to reproduce itself, so to speak. It produces another thing, another one of its own root race type, absolutely similar in kind to itself, for it to reproduce itself. And then I guess the other one dies, even though it really can't die. But the essence of it goes into the Mitasized body that is basically projected out from itself. That is the first root race. And the first root race is in what they would call a mineral state of consciousness. You have the consciousness akin to a mineral or a rock, which is really a form of an analogy that signifies a deep unconscious sleep state, absolute unconsciousness. And they call this the mineral state, or really they really call it a rock state of consciousness. You're not a rock. You're not incarnated into a mineral. You are incarnated into a mineral-like state of perception and consciousness with really almost no consciousness perception at all. And you are on an earth that is barely forming in its astral sphere of aggregation. And almost like an astral nebula, which is, so to speak, only a feeling of warmth in this first stage. This is called the Saturn epoch in the Rosicrucian cosmology, and simply round one on in the first few globes of the Theosophical cosmology. And you go through all these root races on every one of these rounds until you reach the fourth round on the fourth globe of Earth, which they're really Earth in every one of those rounds anyway, but they're so far from really constituting what we think of as the sphere of Earth that as to be incomprehensible. So you get to the fourth stage in the fourth round, and there are Earth incarnations. There are 3 prior incarnations of the Earth before we get to our fourth stage of incarnation of the Earth, which is where we're going to start off. We're on the fourth globe on the fourth Earth. We're on the fourth round on the fourth globe, which is Earth itself, which is Gaia, and is also called, what is it called? It's called Bhumi in the Theosophical tradition. Actually, has a name. And we are in the first root race, which is the Polarian race and the Polarian epoch of that race. And you are a senseless, mindless blob of astral substance. You basically separate through androgynous mitosis to reproduce yourself until we move on to the Hyperborean root race, which is the second root race. And the Hyperborean root race gets the astral body. Sorry, not the astral body. It gets the etheric body. And it gets Bhuddi, the spiritual soul, which will be the vehicle with our vehicle for the Atma, the spiritual spark from the absolute, the reflection of it. And this is the Hyperborean stage of the root races. This is the second root race. Now, there's another thing I did not mention in my last video, which is the fact that according to the Theosophical tradition, each race of, the 7 major root races, because there are sub races within each root race, but the 7 root races, Polarian, Hyperborean, Lemurian, Atlantean, they each have a continent specific to their development. And the Polarian root race, the first root race, is termed such because it is a hidden sacred island or continent in the polar regions, supposedly the North Pole, which is unique in the fact that it will exist until the end of the evolutionary period and will always remain hidden, being of a state of existence that is akin to superphysical. It is not materialized fully. And they reside on this polar continent, which doesn't have a name. I guess you could call it Mount Meru potentially, from the Hindu and Buddhist and Brahmin tradition, where it shows Mount Meru in the North Pole at the top of the earth as a four-sectioned island or continent with a spot in the middle where Mount Meru rises out. That is the first root race. The second root race is the Hyperborean race, and of course it exists in the continent or on the continent called Hyperborea, which is, I guess, a little bit lower from the polar region. And we're not really sure exactly where it existed or what it was, but it was a term from Greek, Greek mythology and ancient Greek stories about the Hyperboreans and the Hyperborean race that was far to the north. And this second root race is a little more dense and has a few extra principles of the seven than the Polarian race, the first root race. They gain the ether body and they gain Bhuddi. So the spiritual spark gets a vehicle in the spiritual soul, which is Bhuddi, and then the ether body joins with the physical body, even though at this point it is not physical. It is still in an astro-etheric state, as is the earth. The earth is still not fully materialized. This is the Hyperborean race, and they reproduce themselves in a form of budding, which it's kind of like there is a protuberance from this mass of this astral etheric being that forms a bud on the exterior of this, say, it's a little sphere, and it starts to protrude out. It starts to bud, and what essentially happens is that the essence of the original being is forced into that budding protuberance from its center, and is it basically bursts out from the side of it. You have a circle and you have a budding protuberance on the side of it, and it as it expands, it absorbs the essence of the original being to reproduce itself into another version of itself. And they called it budding. It's very strange, I know, but the reason they call it budding is because this is the plant state of consciousness and the plant epoch of the human monad, plant-like state of consciousness, which is akin to not fully unconscious sleep, just a deep sleep, a very deep sleep without dreams. It is the plant state of consciousness, and it is in a plant-like existence, they say, and it's also called the sun state or the sun epoch in the Rosicrucian cosmology. And this eventually transforms into the Lemurian epoch, which is something much more familiar to us and something much more able to comprehend and conceptualize than these two previous root races, which are of such a nature that it's very hard to get a concrete image, which is of course the nature of the whole thing, in your mind of what they were like, because they are so far from our current state of humanity that they are really not akin to us. But it's our previous evolution, it is our previous development, and that's our history, our pre-material history as a pre-materialized being. In the Lemurian epoch and in the Lemurian race, this root race is where everything starts to come together and things really start to speed up into differentiation. The first part of the Lemurian root race is a giant semi-etheric, semi-astral, but much more close to being materialized androgyne and hermaphrodite being, which reproduces itself through what they call it the sweat-born and the egg-born. And this sweat is like a perspiration of its life essence and reproductive juice that sweats off the being. It's perspirating, and it as it falls to the ground, it forms into what you could call like a little cocoon or an egg, and then out of this egg is born another version of itself. It is the egg born, and this is how the early stage of the Lemurian root race reproduced itself through this perspiration and sweating that then forms into an egg, and births out another of these hermaphroditic beings. They were they were not bisexual, but binary. They were male and female. They were hermaphroditic, and they weren't fully physical yet. As you reach the big middle part of the Lemurian subraces, because there's 7, you end up at the state and stage where the Earth is about to become materialized the way we see it today. It's not quite as material and dense as it is now, but it is materialized. And the Lemurian race, in its halfway point, materializes, and you have the separation of the sexes into male and female, like I mentioned in the last video near the end. The hermaphroditic being, as it materializes, splits into male and female. And the reason for this is for the development of certain organs of perception that needed the full other half of that being's energy, because each one's male and female, positive and negative. The male is positive in certain ways, the female is negative and receptive in other ways. The opposite energy type is still within them. So the negative is within the male and the positive is within the female. And those energies, now that they're not being used, can be utilized for the growth and development of certain organs of perception for use in the physical material environment in which they are now finding themselves in. And they can reproduce through the normal intercourse that we know as human beings. And bear in mind, this takes place over untold millions or hundreds of thousands of years between each one of these stages. So you have this fall into matter and materialization. This is what's called the original sin. Totally misconstrued in the Bible, totally misconstrued in Abrahamic religions as some sort of action that was immoral that caused them to fall out of the Garden of Eden. The fallout of the Garden of Eden is materialization, and it's a natural part of the cosmic process. And all it means is, in terms of the word sin, is it means the furthest removed from spirit, the source of reality, which is pure spirit. And now you are in the densest, most materialistic state of the cosmos, the physical 3D plane. Thus, you are the furthest removed from spirit. Thus, you're in gross matter. You are, so to speak, in a state of sin, simply meaning furthest from spirit. It was not an action or a fall. The fall is the fall into matter. You fall into materialization. The spirit dips into the materialized realm, splits into the sexes, and you have, so to speak, Adam and Eve, now reproducing the normal way we do. And this is the Lemurian stage after the halfway point. And in each one of these stages, in each one of these root races, there are certain beings that guide the development of each root race once it becomes physicalized. And they call him Manu in the Theosophical tradition. And his charge or mission and job, so to speak, is to gather up the highest types of each root race and basically form a nucleus for the seeding of the next root race, the Atlanteans. And this is done, and the Lemurians, by the way, the Lemurians are ginormous beings. They are supposedly 20 to plus feet tall, and this is where the concept of the giants come from in the Bible, or the, so to speak, in the age of giants and titans, the men of renown and great strength. And Blavatsky calls some of them the sons of will and yoga, and they were exceptionally powerful beings. Now, they didn't have a mental body yet. That is one thing that I have to make perfectly clear. They still did not have reason, logic, or conceptualization, or really even imagination yet. But they were still highly tapped into the spiritual realm and still had extremely powerful spiritual perception. Their third eye was very active, and they didn't need to have reason and logic yet because they could manifest at will within the physical plane. They had the power over the life force and over the very tenuous state of physical matter that existed at the time. We're more dense now. It was physical, but it was still rather elastic and malleable. And these great without great unreasoning but powerfully spiritual beings, the Lemurians could manipulate matter intuitively or instinctively around them. And that was what one of their major abilities was. They also started to develop the rudiments of memory later on. And the men and women have two different training types, but we won't go into that in this video. So you have the Lemurians, you have male and female. They're huge, powerful, spiritually psychic beings that have an intuitive grasp over matter and the life force and can manipulate it, but they don't think about manipulating it. There's no thought involved. It's an instinct. And as you move out of this root race into the Atlanteans, things begin to change. The continent of Lemuria is destroyed by volcanism, and that's another one of the major tenets of this cosmology and the root races is each root race faces a sort of destruction, followed by the next root race being rebirthed into the new continent, which is then Atlantis at the time. But there's always a destruction between fire and the next time water and then fire. The first time, well, the one with Lemuria, they're, so to speak, destroyed by fire, volcanism, and their continent sinks, and the remnants of it are, Australia, New Zealand, Madagascar, and all the islands in between Australia and South America, which are there are a whole bunch of them, including um, what's Easter Island with those giant heads. And that's the fall of Lemuria, and they didn't do anything wrong. It's just it has to. Everything rises and falls. It's one of the hermetic laws of rhythm. Everything has its rise and fall, just like the root races do, just like everything does. And there has to be a fall for the rise of the next root race. Now, at the same time, there are certain types of each root race that still remain. Not all are destroyed, but they become stragglers and start to degenerate, to devolve back into their primitive type, and they don't further develop themselves. It's not in the scheme for them to continually develop after that once the seed of the next root race begins. And so the Atlanteans are the next root race, which is the fourth one. And they are everything you think they are. They begin to have the rudiments of a mental body, and they sort of can reason and use logic to a degree. And not much in the beginning of the sub races, but halfway through and near the end, they have a much greater ability to do things like what we consider basic reasoning and logical processes. But what they did have through a large portion of the Atlantean epoch and the Atlantean races was their natural psychism was still abundant, and many of them. And they had a high culture and a high civilization with extraordinary levels of technology. And they lived on the Atlantean continent, which was in the middle of the Atlantic, of course, but it was not an island, it was an entire continent and stretched from, our coast in America over to the European coast. It was enormous. And the height of the Atlantean power was supposedly a million years ago, with the first big, you know, fall into the ocean by this continent. Parts of it broke off over time. Was according to the Theosophical chronology, was 850,000 years ago. Whether you want to believe that or not, that is when the large portion of that continent sank. But they had been around for 150,000 or more years than that already, and had the height of their existence and power. They were an amazing culture, but they started to delve into black magic, and they got their ego really started to come out, and they became worshippers of the human form. And they created enormous statues, and their kings became arrogant with power, worshiping themselves and erecting enormous statues of themselves and of the human form, and just absolutely falling into total egoic consciousness. Um, at the worst part of it, really, and engaging in total practices of black magic and summoning lower dimensional astral beings to do all sorts of terrible things. And they warred with everyone else around them because there were other cultures starting to come up at the time. But so this is where the original story that we know of from Plato and from Egypt of the island of Atlantis, which was the last part of Atlantis, which was sunk it was 12,000 years ago or so, or maybe 15,000 years ago, they were absolutely dark with sin at that point, engaging in all sorts of genetic engineering, genetic tampering, black magic, sorcery, summoning of lower astral demons and dark beings to engage in astral vampirism and a whole horde of other things that Edgar Casey talks about with this with something called the Belial Group, which engages in an absolute militaristic, warmongering slaughter of everything around them and eventually destroys themselves and sinks a large part of their own island and whatever structures they had left in the Atlantean culture. And, they fall beneath the waves. Now, this is where the fragmenting of the mystery schools occurs and the rise of the fifth post-Atlantean races, the Aryan race, which is not white. It is the first Aryans are actually the Hindus, and they are the remnants of the mystery schools of the Atlanteans, the white magic priests and hierophants and adepts that were still aware of what was going on and was going to come in Atlantis and fled before the total fall and destruction of their culture. They went and seeded in the area of northern India and probably Tibet and the Gobi Desert, a civilization that was spectacular in spiritual practice and spiritual knowledge, and they kept civilization going, and that was the birthing and seeding of the fifth root race, which of what we are a part of in the current world today. We are the fifth post-Atlantean epoch and the fifth root race, the Aryan race, of which has many different subraces, and there are we have the Egyptians, the Chaldeans, the Sumerians, the Babylonians, the Indians, the Anglo-Saxons, the what are they called, the Teutonians, and then the Americans, which are at this point the furthest we've gotten, which is where the seed of the sixth subrace of the fifth root race is going to seed itself, according to Blavatsky, is in America. And the next one, the seventh one, the last one of the subraces of this root race will be Slavic, according to Blavatsky and Rudolf Steiner. So we still have to wait and find out how that's going to turn out and whether those predictions will be accurate and correct. At the moment, America's not looking so great. So, our spirituality is pretty much obliterated, and we are an absolute consumer driven, materialistic, egoic culture. Not, largely by design, but, you know, it's not really looking good because they also stated if America failed to see the next sub root race, it would have to move east to Russia or just simply east. They mainly say east. So once you get the fifth root race after the fall of Atlantis, you get the full development of the mental body, of the mind, of the reasoning faculties, the logical faculties, the conceptualization, and you lose the psychic. You lose the tapping into spirit instinctively or intuitively or easily. Now, that's not to say you cannot redevelop them from their latent potencies, but it's not natural. It is no longer a natural part of our constitution to be psychic. It's just we had to exchange that or lose that to gain the mind and reason and logic to conquer the material world around us. Now, on the continuing arc, we will regain these abilities. We will etherize and we will reignite these latent potencies and potential of the psychic body and the spiritual bodies. But to dip all the way deep, deep, deep into matter, you had to lose those to gain reason and the mind, which we will then gain back on the further arc on the way up in evolution and spiritual development. We regain those same abilities while also keeping the mental body and the mind at its full potential. Now, this needs to be borne in mind. We will fail first of all, I want to show you this. This is the Lemurian non-physical, Hyperborean non-physical, Lemurians, Atlantean subraces. These are the subraces. We actually have the original Semites, Akkadians, Mongolians, which then lead to the Aryans, and then here's the Aryans, and you go on down. And I just wanted to show that brief depiction of what some esotericists and occultists have said some of the root races are of the Atlanteans, which would be including the Semites, the Akkadians, and the Mongolians. And then we reach the post-Atlantean and the Aryans. And so at this point, we are here at the Aryan mental root race leading up to the Trivian astral sixth root race, which is very far away. At the moment, we're heading towards the next subrace, as they would say, which is in America. The seed of it is supposed to develop in America if we, get our cards right, so to speak. So this is the outline and introduction to what they call the root races. And I know it's not particularly easy to follow, and I've tried to do my best to explain it. It is not easy, and it's convoluted, it's foreign, it's non-traditional, and it's complex. And it's not going to be easy, but you got to wrap your head around these foundational concepts to understand our origins. Because as you can see, if you've been following me this entire time, it's not in the ancient aliens cosmology. It's not in the New Age paradigms at all. It's not in any of these alternative spiritual belief systems. It is only in the esoteric tradition that you find this information, and that is the only place you'll find it. And it is essential to understand it because there are many forces trying to deviate us from our origin story. And the reason they would want to do that is, to me, very obvious and very plain. They want you to believe that aliens were your progenitors, and they want you hyper focused on genetics to the exclusion of all else. And like I said in the first video, genetics is never mentioned in any of these books, in any of these cosmologies. Genetics is not even a word in the entirety of the book, 1,600 pages. Not mentioned a single time, because it's your genetics has nothing to do with anything but your body, your physical body, your vehicle, your lowest vehicle. When you're most developed, but still your lowest, your hereditary. And that is not how things get passed on with the other bodies. Your astral body, your ether body, your ego, your spiritual bodies, your mental body, none of that has anything to do with the physical body's genetics at all. Nothing. There's no astral genetics, etheric genetics, mental genetics. None of that's in there. That doesn't exist. So just absolutely remove that from your consciousness. Genetics has nothing to do with any of this. If you hear the word genetics mentioned in any sort of spiritual context, know immediately it is misinformation. It is spiritual misinformation, trying to drive you from the correct interpretation of your spirituality and your spiritual being. Genetics has nothing to do with it. And the second reason that all of this must be well understood is because of transhumanism and what is called the eighth sphere and the Ahrimanic force or forces. There is an entity called Ahriman in the Rudolf Steiner cosmology, specific to him, and the eighth sphere is mentioned by both Steiner and Blavatsky, and is one of the most secretive concepts within the whole occult tradition that's barely any information about it at all. There are lower dimensional beings that are failed beings called the Ahrimanic forces. They were of a certain life wave ahead of us that failed and chose to deviate from their intended spiritual development path and jumped out of the chain of their development and are basically almost like rogue agents that are failed beings. They are lower dimensional beings. And they are ensnaring us with technology, transhumanism, AI, and cultural inversion of where we need to be and what we need to be engaging in right now. Almost everything that you see in our social cultural context that is an inversion of traditional harmonies is from this archontic force, or from another force called the luciferic force. But that's a whole nother one. The one I want to focus on in the next video is what's called the eighth sphere and the harmonic entity and forces that are driving this post 21st century technological dystopian AI system of Elon Musk, Peter Thiel, Sam Altman, and all these other transhumanists that want to merge with AI and say the singularity is very near, and we need to basically become cyborgs. Well, that's exactly what these interdimensional beings would like us to do, because then they'll have us trapped in the materium, and they may even be able to re-ensoul on us because they are not able to have a vehicle right now because they jumped out of their path. So that is the short introduction for the next podcast, which will be on the harmonic and luciferic forces, the eighth sphere, transhumanism, AI, and where we will go as humanity if we fail to take the right path in the next century or two and decide to deviate into a transhumanist ideology where we will devolve ourselves into man machine as opposed to etherized spiritual human. So these are the choices ahead of us, and this is one of the this is the main primary reason that